know that 5.5 trillion cigarettes are made each year?
Since that's such a big number, maybe you should use scientific notation.
Scientific notation is when you take a number that is greater than 1 and less than 10 and multiply it by a number with a base of 10 and a power. Since 5.5 trillion is such a big number, it would be 5.5 times 10 to the 12th because trillion has 12 zeros. 35% of all men in the US smoke and 22% of all women in the US smoke.
So what would be the number of the men and women that smoke?
For the men, you'd have to make a ratio which would be 35 over 100 equals x over 138,100,000. Since there are 138,100,000 men in the US, you would have to divide that number by 100 and then multiply it by 35 to find 35% of that number, which would equal 48,335,000. For the women, you would have to make a ratio that would be 22 over 100 equals x over 143,400,000. Since there are 143,400,000 women in the US, you would have to divide that number by 100 and then multiply it by 22 to find 22% of that number, which would be 31,548,000. The average person smokes about 100 cigarettes each year.
So what's the number of cigarettes that are smoked by men and women in the US?
You would take the number of men in the US who smoke and multiply that number by 100 to see how many cigarettes are smoked by the men in the US, which would equal 4,833,500,000. To find the number of cigarettes smoked by women in the US, you would take 31,548,000 and multiply that number by 100 to find that the answer is 3,154,800,000. The volume of a cigarette would be the radius squared times pi and then multiplied by the height. The radius of the cigarette is 4.05 millimeters and the height is 84 millimeters. You would then square 4.05 millimeters to get the area of the circle, which would equal 16.4025 millimeters squared, and then multiply that by pi to get 51.53 millimeters squared. You would then multiply that number by 84 to then get a final answer of 4,329 millimeters cubed for the volume of a cigarette. The volume of 5.5 trillion cigarettes is just 4,329 millimeters cubed times 5.5 trillion, which would equal 2.38095 times 10 to the 16th. So how many Olympic pools would be filled with all those cigarettes? Well, you would then find the volume of an Olympic pool, which is 50 meters long, 25 meters wide, and 2 meters deep. You would multiply each of those numbers by 1,000 to find how many millimeters that is, which would be 50,000 millimeters times 25,000 millimeters times 2,000 milliliters, which would then equal 2.5 trillion millimeters cubed. After that, you would take 2.38095 times 10 to the 16th and divide it by 2.5 trillion millimeters cubed to find out that 9,523 Olympic pools can be filled with all those cigarettes.